when we went into that area where we always took contact, we only took contact, one or two more times, and it was just pot shots. It wasn't a real engagement.
Yeah.
And so the great part is that it allowed us to, there was an abandoned kind of bazaar or market right across the street from the base, and because of the enemy fighters and the intimidation, most of the merchants didn't come. The shops have been closed down, and so once we were able to reduce the number of enemy fighters there, we were able to work with the locals, and we brought back the bazaar, and so we provided security for it. And the first week, they did it every Sunday, and the first week, maybe it was every Friday. Anyway, the first week, there was maybe 50 to 75 people, a handful of merchants, and 3 months later, by the time we left, there were probably 2,000 to 3,000 people between merchants and civilians that would show up to purchase what they needed and to sell their wares. So it was pretty cool to see that transformation in the area.
And do you remember the first time that you or your unit that you were with came under fire?
I do, yeah.
What was that like?
It was surprising. It had been a shitty, frustrating day for a number of reasons unrelated to getting attacked, and so I remember hearing the first few rounds snap overhead, and just thinking to myself, like, you gotta be kidding me. And then I turn around, and the first thing I see is one of my Marines just laying on his back like a turtle, and he was wearing the radio, and so he's in a pack, and he's. I thought he'd been shot, right, because he's flailing around on his back, and he had just tried to take cover and tripped and fallen, and so he was fine. And so it was just hilarious because the first reaction was, I would have thought it would have been fear or uncertainty, and it was just like frustration and anger.
Yeah. And how would you describe being in like a firefight to people like us who have like no idea what that is like?
It's I gotta give credit, back to your first question, the sergeant instructors. I mean, the Marine Corps does a phenomenal job training Marines, and so there's tons of sayings like that we would get drilled into us that gosh, what were some of them? I can only remember part of it. Anyway, the point was that you would have kind of an initial reaction or shock or frustration or whatever, 'cause 9 out of 10 times the contact would take you by surprise. But then your training took over, and your Marines training took over, and they knew exactly what they needed to do, and everyone executed unbelievably well. It was, and so you're not really thinking about being in a firefight. You're thinking about doing your job. You're thinking about what you need to do to protect yourself and your Marines and close with and destroy the enemy. So that was probably the biggest surprise. After my initial kind of shock, frustration, you've got to be kidding me. Like in hindsight, I was like, it didn't feel that unusual. Like it was surprising how normal it all felt, like looking back on it after and kind of moving through it.
Yeah. And was this something that was pretty rare during your deployment?
I wouldn't say it was rare. It was very episodic.
Yeah.
Especially so when we were in the city, it was more rare. That was a more controlled area. So there were fewer engagements, more IEDs.
Mm-hmm.
When we went out to the desert, the first 2 months, it was a lot more frequent contact, especially in the northern part of our AO. But after the one engagement I mentioned where we were able to reduce a significant amount of their fighters, it was pretty calm for the rest of for the last month and a half, 2 months. Few pop shots here or there and a few IEDs, but it was amazing the difference that one engagement made in that area.
Yeah. And I believe you mentioned you received a couple of service medals.
I did, yeah. I received the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal and with Combat Distinguishing Device, and the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, again with the Combat Distinguishing Device. That was for my second deployment to Afghanistan. So first deployment, I was a platoon commander as part of a battalion, and we kind of owned the area of operations. My second deployment, I was on an advisor team, so we embedded with a Afghan National Army battalion and served as advisors and trainers and mentors to them.
Yeah.
And so it was a very different experience where, my first deployment, leave the wire with guys you trained with, you knew exactly what was going to happen. You were, you controlled the battle space, it was one unit. My second deployment, it would be 4 of us out with, 120, 150 Afghan national soldiers, and we weren't in control. They were in control, and we were just there to assist. So it was a very, very different experience, especially when you took contact in those two different situations.
Yeah. And how far apart were those two deployments?
Gosh, I don't know, 6-8 months.
Yeah.
They were pretty close.
And in between them, what were you doing?
Well, we got back and everyone got 3 weeks of post-deployment leave, and then came back and had the opportunity to join the advisor team almost immediately after getting back to our unit post-deployment leave, and then immediately started the training for that deployment.
Yeah. And do you remember the day you left Afghanistan on your first deployment?
I don't remember the date. I definitely remember, it's funny. It's not like, it's not like it's not like here where you just hop on a plane and then you're in another city. I mean, so I remember walking off the base onto the helicopter, and so then the helicopter took us to a larger base where we stayed for a couple of days, right? 'Cause the logistics of moving, 1,000 Marines and all their equipment and gear is significant. So it wasn't like everything was lined up. So we'd fly out of our base, and then you're at a larger base, so you're still in a war zone, although it doesn't necessarily feel like it because you're in this massive base, but the base is still getting attacked every now and then. But it's it's a different mindset, and so you don't really have anything to do because you're just waiting for transport. So then from there, a few days, and then back to Kazakhstan, if I remember correctly, again, 3 or 4 days there. Double check to make sure we're not, we'd get inspected to make sure we weren't bringing home ammo or bringing home war trophies or anything like that we weren't supposed to. And then we flew to Germany. I think Germany, we were just there for 12 hours, and then again back through Maine, and then finally back to Camp Lejeune. So to get back, it was probably almost 10 plus days from the day we flew out on helos from our patrol base. So I definitely remember walking onto the helicopter and looking back at the base. But then it's not as I don't know what the word is, not as memorable as significant as is depicted in the movies, right? Like, 'cause in the movies they leave the battlefield and then the next scene is them getting home, so you just think that it's going to be this quick trip, and in reality it's like a 10 to 14 day affair. So that was kind of funny.
Yeah. And when you were with your unit back in Camp Lejeune, was it just training again for the next deployment?
Yeah, so I got detached from 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, and went to the 2nd MEF, or 2 MEF, and that was the parent unit to the advisor teams, and so there was a very different pre-deployment workup training regime for an advisor team versus infantry battalion. So there were only 20 of us on the team, and it was we got to do a lot of really neat training. Typically an advisor team is a role that's conducted by special forces. That's most of what special forces do, actually, not kick down doors like on all the movies. And so, but because of the pace of the withdrawal, they didn't have enough advisor teams to help transition the Afghan National Army and National Police. So both the Army and the Marines in particular had to create a bunch of these advisor teams to supplement the special forces and be part of the transition, because you couldn't just go from tens of thousands of Marines in country across a ton of bases to zero overnight.
Yeah. And what was different about this second deployment from the first?
I mean, it was almost like night and day. You're a smaller team. We were on a Marine base that was still Marine. Half of it was still Marine guarded and controlled, but right across the way was the Afghan National Army, and then we were just a much smaller unit, so we operated more autonomously. We didn't have the same numbers that we did my first deployment, and our mission wasn't to conduct patrols. Our mission was to train and educate and teach the Afghan National Army soldiers. And so we would do a lot of training exercises with them. We would go out with them, meet the local leaders and elders. We would help them plan patrols, but we couldn't plan our own patrols. We couldn't do it for them. So it was just a completely different mindset, and completely different attitude. And like I said, once you're outside the wire, it's very different being outside with 12, 14, 18 Marines and no one else, versus being out with 4 Marines and 150 to 200 Afghan National Army soldiers, and you're not in control. You're just along for the ride, and so it definitely took some getting used to. It was more unsettling than I anticipated at first.
Yeah. And I'm guessing that you got to meet some of the Afghan soldiers.
Yeah, we got really close with them. I was in charge of advising 3 company commanders, who were all lieutenants or captains, and so over the course of 7 months, got to know them well, got to know some of their soldiers pretty well. So did my Marines. Became close with some of them, and unfortunately, a few of the soldiers that we got pretty close with were killed while we were there, which was rough.
Yeah. And did your unit ever experience casualties?
No, both times we were really lucky. We had one guy break his heel jumping across the canal. We had one guy rupture his eardrum when a grenade, he was behind a berm and a grenade went off on the other side. And that was it. We were super fortunate that we didn't have anyone shot. We had a couple guys, a couple of vehicles hit IEDs, but they were relatively small, and so minor concussions, stuff like that. So we were super fortunate.
Yeah. And besides what you've already talked about, what are just some of your most memorable experiences from that second deployment?
One was we did a massive operation. So there was a road that the Kajaki Dam had a road that came down that ran along the Helmand River, and basically there were west of the road for a couple hundred meters was safe, and east of the road was all generally controlled by Afghan forces. And so there was a bit of a stronghold of fighters still on the between the road and the river spanning a significant distance running south from the dam. So we had to coordinate a massive operation with multiple Afghan Army units, multiple Marine units, and multiple. We actually worked with the Georgian forces. They were on our adjoining area of operations. So you had a lot of different people involved. You had a lot going on. It was a massive battle space, and we were out there for, I don't know, 7 days. We would sleep in people's homes. We'd have to get resupplied via helicopter. On that operation, I think we ended up pulling, not me personally, but in the course of the operation, we pulled out like 300 or 400 IEDs.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a number of firefights along the way. And then we finally got to the river, and we set up, and we had intel reports there was going to be a big counterattack. And so we set up, through the night waiting for that, and fortunately it never came. But that was a wild 7 days. And my first deployment, like even when I was out on patrol, like again, you're surrounded by a decent number of Marines, like never felt alone, never felt like sequestered or far away from my unit. And it was definitely isolating, being that far out with that few Marines and that many other forces.
Yeah. Do you still remember who you were with on that deployment?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. Do you still stay in touch with them?
I do, yeah. One of the other lieutenants was one of the groomsmen in my wedding. And yeah, I still keep in touch with them. I still keep in touch with my platoon sergeant from my first deployment. He was probably one of the best Marines I ever encountered. I still keep in touch to some extent with my commanding officer from my second deployment. I'm convinced he'll be the commandant of the Marine Corps one of these days. He was a phenomenal leader. And then, yeah, every now and then we'll get a text or exchange an email with guys I served with.
Yeah. And so, when did your second deployment end?
It ended in March of 2013.
Yeah. So, this was like 3 years after your first deployment, was it?
Yeah, about.
Yeah. And was the return home process like the same with the flights through Kazakhstan?
It was even worse, because at least when you're flying a battalion out, you can charter an entire aircraft, and so when you're just trying to get 20 guys out, it's a lot harder. So every stop along the way was shorter. I think we spent almost 2 weeks in Qatar at an Air Force base there, which was eye-opening to see just how nice Air Force facilities are. I mean, it was an Air Force base. It had 2 pools. It had a bar. No one was ever in uniform, it seemed like.
Yeah.
You could leave the base. I mean, it's a friendly country, right? So you could leave the base, go out into town. I mean, we were not allowed to do that, but people that were stationed there could. There was a mall. It was wild. It was definitely eye-opening, and had some funny stories. Typical service rivalry type stuff from that, and then, but yeah, so it was a much more elongated, but then, but otherwise pretty similar process.
Yeah. And did you have any assignments with the Marines after that deployment?
No, that was pretty much the end of my first 4 years that were on my contract, and while I was in Afghanistan the second time, I decided that I wanted to propose to my girlfriend at the time, and my old boss from my firm in Chicago reached out to me and wanted me to come back and work for him, and so that kind of And then when I got back to the States, it was a very different, we were well into the drawdown. And so it was a very different, a peacetime Marine Corps is very different than a wartime Marine Corps, and you shift very quickly from, doing field exercises and training for your job as an infantry Marine to, now it's about uniform inspections, and it's about parades and ceremonies, and there's not money for, for rounds to do live ranges or to do, training. So it's just a very different environment that I came back to, and so those three things really kind of combined to say, hey, this has been a phenomenal experience, but it's time for me to get out and go back to the civilian world. So I got back in late March from Afghanistan, and by June 10th, I was sitting at my desk at my new job back in Chicago.
And what was that readjusting process like?
It was harder than I thought it was going to be. I was going back to the same city, I was going back to the same firm, same colleagues. And again, when you're around a bunch of people that think and act very similar to you and have the same purpose as Marines that you do, I didn't feel like I had changed much in my time as a person in the Marine Corps. And then when I got out and I was around people that were different than me again, I started to realize how much I had actually changed. And so that was a significant adjustment to go, especially in that timeline, to go from being surrounded by Marines, being in combat, to having, I didn't know any veterans in Chicago.
Yeah.
So I went about, I just started, volunteering at different nonprofits that serve veterans, and tried a bunch of different out. I got really lucky. I found two that were phenomenal organizations that I met some really great people and kind of rebuilt that veteran community, which was hugely helpful to adjusting back.
Yeah. And did you ever reunite with your family or old friends from before the Marines?
Yeah, all of them. Yeah, they were, a number of them came to North Carolina both times I got back from Afghanistan, and there are days, now it's been so long, but even back then, I hadn't been out for a year, and there were days where I'd be like it never even happened, because everything was just kind of back to the way it was before.
Yeah. And did you ever go back to your old hometown?
Yeah, I went back to Aspen in December of 2018, actually, with my wife, which was kind of cool. I hadn't been back there in probably 30 years. So the house I grew up in was still there. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah. So what was the day that you were formally discharged?
It was June 13th. June 13th, 2013.
What was that like?
Well, again, it was anticlimactic because you accrue leave, especially while you're on deployments, and because the majority of my time in the fleet had been spent either doing pre-deployment training where you were in California or out in the field, so you weren't taking leave, or I was in Afghanistan. I had like a month of quote unquote terminal leave. So basically, like the day that I was officially discharged from the Marine Corps, like I was at work at my office at my new job in Chicago, because I'd already left. It was very anticlimactic, right? Like I lived off base. It's not like the movies, right? I packed up all my stuff and I drove out of town, and it was like moving from anywhere else. It was kind of surreal. Again, like, did that really just happen? Is this really over? It was just very anticlimactic.
Yeah. And so what did you do for a living after you left the Marines?
So I worked as an analyst on at a firm that runs mutual funds. So we invested, our clients were pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and we invested their money into U.S. public equities on their behalf.
Yeah. Did you ever find that you missed anything about military life?
Yeah, I mean, I miss the people immensely. I missed it's not perfect, and there's definitely politics, and especially as you go up in the ranks, but like, it's one of the few, pure meritocracies left. It's an incredible sense of purpose that you lose when you come out. And yeah, there are days that I miss it, for sure.
Yeah. So how do you think your service changed you as a person?
Surprisingly, it made me more tolerant. It made me understand that, for the most part, we're not all as different as we often believe we are. It gave me a lot more confidence in myself, having proven to myself that I could get through training, that I could actually become a Marine, that I could go to a combat zone and do the right thing when I was getting shot at. So I had more confidence, gave me a much broader perspective of the world, and it gave me a chance to experience relationships with my Marines that it's just indescribable.
Yeah. If you could go back in time, would you tell your younger self to join the Marines again?
Yeah, I just tell my younger self to do it sooner.
So, yeah, I just have a few more questions, just like closing remarks.
Sure.
Yeah. Nowadays, is there anything that still ties you back to the service, whether that's like people or organizations?
Definitely people. I mean, a lot of the Marines I served with are still in. I'm still on active duty. So I keep in touch with them, and then I've been involved with a number of organizations. One is Bunker Labs. They help veterans who want to be entrepreneurs. And then another organization is the Veterans Leadership Council, which is basically a professional network that we created for veterans that are out of the military, obviously, and are rising leaders in business and government. Because the interesting thing is, right after World War II, even Vietnam and Korea, like, the war had a definite end, and everyone more or less came home at around the same time. And so it was a much more and it was especially World War II, was a much broader set of the population. So your odds of running into someone who had served were much, much greater, and there were more people that were connected to veterans than there are today. I mean, today 1% of the population serves, right? So, and it's it's an increasingly insular 1% of military families. So the dad served, the kids serve. It just goes down the line. So the idea of both Bunker Labs and the Veterans Leadership Council is to basically try to expand the network of veterans that are coming out, and that need to be connected back to the other 99% of people who didn't serve.
Yeah. Do you think that the public, like the 99% that hasn't served, do you think we understand veterans in an accurate way?
No, I don't. I think the biggest misperception is that veterans are victims, and there certainly are people that have been through horrific things. There are veterans that struggle with depression and suicide. But the reality is that most veterans aren't victims. Like, we we volunteered to go to war. We
Yeah.
went through some of the toughest selection and then the best training that you can go through. And, and then we went through a unimaginable experience, going to war. And we came back and people treat us like we're broken, and we're not.
Yeah.
We have a tremendous skill set, that we um, to benefit our communities. And so I think that misperception that all of us are broken, or victims is the biggest issue today.
Yeah. Is there anything besides like that misconception that you wish more people knew about veterans?
I just wish more people knew veterans. I mean, it's amazing how many people have never met someone that's served, especially someone that served post 9/11.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people have grandparents or, their friends' grandparents were in World War II. But a lot of people, that I encounter, I'm the first person they've ever met that served in Iraq or Afghanistan. So, now I will say the reaction is much more positive than, say, folks that came back after Vietnam.
Yeah.
Which is huge. I mean, I've talked to some of those guys, and it's just amazing the shit that they went through, and coming home to getting spit on, and I mean,
Mhm.
that's just crazy. So I do think that, I don't want to sound like people don't appreciate veterans, but because they do, and they're generally very kind and appreciative. I just think there's this perception that we're all broken. That's not true.
Yeah. And on that note, would you say that you and other Marines who are returning from Afghanistan, were you welcomed in a positive way or in a negative way?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Super positive. Super positive. Absolutely. And again, which is the biggest difference, right? There's plenty of people that don't agree with the war, but that never got in the way of how people responded to me. I've never experienced anything but positive reception.
All right. Yeah, so we're just down to the last two questions now. I think you've talked about this a lot, but what would you say are like the life lessons you learned from your time in the Marines?
So one of the biggest ones that I actually apply to my job in the investing world which was drilled into us at IOC, is that, again, which surprised me given that we're dealing with life and death circumstances, but a 70% solution executed violently now is always better than a 100% solution executed later. And because in reality, when you're fighting a living, breathing, thinking person, there is no such thing as a 100% solution. And so waiting and being indecisive can be worse than making a suboptimal decision. And so I think that's true in investing. Obviously, we're not fighting an enemy, but the market is constantly repricing information, right? And so we sometimes get fooled into thinking that we can wait and get more information. But while we're waiting for that information, the prices of the securities that we invest in are changing and incorporating that information, right?
Yeah.
Same as the enemy does. We're getting more information, but so is our enemy, in country. So that's one that's really stuck with me. The diversity and or lack thereof, I guess, of all of us in a base unit was eye-opening. And those were the big ones. Tolerance, increasing tolerance. It surprised me to think now that going to a war zone would make me a calmer, more accepting person. But that's part of what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, that's about it. What like message would you like to leave for people now or in the future who might watch this interview?
That was a great experience. I'd recommend it to anyone. You know, people, now that I have kids, people ask me all the time, oh, are you going to let your kids join the military? And my answer is I hope they do. I'm not, they'll choose their own path, but I'm certainly not going to discourage them. It was one of the best experiences of my life, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat.
Well, that's about all I have, so.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Well,
thank you very much for
yeah,
coming.
thank you. Sorry, I guess I was a little more long-winded than I thought.
That was good, yeah.